His Promised Land, Chapter 10. It is hardly necessary for me to say that I am making no effort to give in detail accounts of the many men and women who I helped escape into Canada in this journal. It was only now and then anything unusual came to me. In the main, my work was to continuously get the fugitives out of town, see them safely passed on to agents of the Underground Railroad. The Fiery Cross of Scotland never traveled faster than the reports of these events. They were discussed in the streets of the city, the cabins of woodsmen, and they penetrated the remote corners of the Union. The Southland became excited and swore vengeance on abductors and their abettors, and after every event there was an explosion of ill feeling which found vent in angry threats. I cite these incidents to show that what danger one encountered when deliberately sought and ran away fugitives. In spite of threats and dangers, a number of men in the borderland were constantly rounding up parties and frequently going after them to lead them secretly across the Ohio. There was an excitement about the game that appealed to me in my younger days, and I really believe I enjoyed the nightly adventures with my ever-changing flock. By this time, I had become proprietor of an iron foundry. I had married and purchased a home next to my place of business, both of which were located on the bank of the river. There was working for me a man who lived across the river in Kentucky and whose father owned several people. This man kept chiding me about my habits of prowling around at night, taking charge of fugitives. I stoutly denied such proclivities, but from time to time he would come back to the subject until one day he said to me, "You are such a brave fellow. Why don't you run away some of the old man's people?" I promptly disclaimed any such purpose, but at the same time I secretly vowed I would take him at his word. Shortly after dark the same day, I loosened my skiff and made my way slowly across the river, landing below a road that led up to the house of my friend. The purpose of my excursion was to get in touch, if possible, with some of the people whom I hoped to run off. Pulling my skiff on shore, I quietly stole up to the top of the bank and came into the road. The trees grew on both sides of the highway, making it quite dark. Being on hostile soil, I was careful to keep in the grass rather than on the hard road, where my footsteps could be heard. It was fortunate I took this precaution, for I had hardly gone a quarter of a mile when I heard voices ahead of me. Secreting myself in the bushes, I waited to see who the men were. Shortly afterwards, my friend came in sight, puffing away at a cigar. He was accompanied by one of his father's men, in fact, the very one I wished to see. The two went down the road to the river. As I was in a safe hiding place, I decided to stay and await results. In a very short time, one of the men came back. It was so dark I could not see who it was, but as the man was not smoking, I felt sure it was the one I wanted. Being somewhat in doubt, I left him go by. As soon as he had passed, I slipped out and followed him until he came to a clearing, when I distinctly saw I was on the heels of a white man. Darting to one side of the road into the bushes, I made such a racket he stopped and began whistling for his dogs, which he thought were following him and had made the noise. I waited until he went on, and then hurried back to my skiff, breathing easier after my close call. My narrow escape made me more cautious than ever the next night when I went back to communicate with my man. The quarters were so close to the house that I did not dare go to the cabins, but contented myself with lying in the bushes along the road, waiting an opportunity to speak to the man. It was the third night before my chance came. Then, like the first time I saw them, the two men came down the road and passed me. I hurried to a cornfield near the highway, where, hiding in the fence corner, I could get a good view of anyone passing by before I spoke. In a little while, I saw a figure coming back. I lay with both eyes peering through the cracks of the rail fence, anxiously waiting for a good look at the man's face. This time I saw plainly it was the one I wanted. As he came opposite me, without moving, I called to him softly. At that period of time, men were not startled by being called by name at any time or place, So when I spoke the second time, the man stopped, and after looking around, said for me to go into the woods and he would meet me. He walked on for a short distance, then turning came back. In the meantime, I hurried as fast as I could to the woods, keeping within the shadow of the fence. Once within the protection of the forest, I came out on the highway and waited for my man to return. He came back leisurely so as not to excite suspicion. You may imagine he was curious to know who I was and what was wanted. He knew me by reputation, so when I gave him my name, he desired no further credentials. When I told him I wanted to run him away, he said he had a wife and a little baby and would not go and leave them. Being determined to execute my plan, I asked him to be ready to go the following night. I would take them all. He fell in with my scheme, and before we parted, it was all arranged. He was to meet me at the same place a week later, claiming he could not be ready in a day. These plans had hardly been arranged when my companion startled me by giving a shriek and starting down the road as fast as his legs would carry him. Glancing hastily around to see what had caused his alarm, I was just in time to see a man with a club raised ready to strike me. My opponent was so close I barely had time to dodge the blow, which was aimed at my head, receiving it upon the left shoulder. The weight of the stick staggered me. My assailant, thinking he had me under his control, attempted to trip me to the ground at the same time. I was a desperate plight, and I knew it. It was not the time for the gentle blows and explanations. When my assailant dropped the stick, I felt it was a fair fight. What advantage he had in his hold on me was only momentary, for being of muscular build, I broke away from him with ease. When he saw I was not going to be an easy victim, he made for his club, and as he stooped over to pick it up, I leaped on his back, forcing his face into the dirt of the road. Grabbing a handful of dust, I turned the man over and threw it in his face and eyes. Having blinded my assailant for a moment, I broke away and ran down the road to my boat. It all happened so quickly, I did not have a chance to see who my assailant was. When out on an expedition, it was my usual custom to wear different clothes and a different hat than usual, so that my failure to recognize the man I thought was good evidence that he did not identify me. I felt rather queer when I went into the shop the next morning and confronted my workman from Kentucky. He was plainly not my assailant, as his face showed no evidence of the encounter of the night before. He was not suspicious of me in the least, for he greeted me as usual, much to my surprise. Later in the day, one of my men came to see me with the story of how a patrol got into a fight with a fugitive the night before across the river and lost his man. My relief can be better imagined than expressed. Strange as it may seem, on the morning of the day I was to meet the man and his family, the Kentuckian chided me about not being able to run away any of his people. I told him I was too busy with the foundry to give attention to outside affairs. He chuckled to himself over the matter as if it was a good joke on me. Owing to the sudden termination of my conference with the would-be fugitive on the night I was attacked by the patrol, I was not sure that my man would keep his appointment. Since I had run such risks in the case, I was determined now to carry the project through at any cost. True to my word, a week later I was at the appointed place to meet my party of runaways. This time I concealed my boat carefully, for I wanted no miscarrying of my plans, and after lying in the bushes for a while, and my man not showing up, I decided to go after him. It was ticklish work, but I felt it to be necessary if I expected to carry out my plan. There was quite an open space between the woods and the cabins. Instead of following the road, I went in the shadows of the trees, coming out in the field back of the quarters. As the corn was half grown, I had no difficulty working up to the row of log cabins. There was a glow of candles through the windows of the big house, which surprised me at such an hour of the night. I came up opposite the cabins and stood looking at them, wondering how I was going to be able to find which one my man lived in. While I was hesitating, the door of one of the shacks opened, and my man came out. He walked up and down in front of his cabin nervously several times, then started for the cornfield. As the man was by himself, I felt sure there was something wrong, since the understanding between us was that he was to bring his wife and child to the rendezvous. Halfway between his cabin and the field, he stopped and listened for a moment, and then hurried to conceal himself in the growing corn. He entered in touching distance of where I was standing, so I had no trouble in stopping him. Things had gone wrong, just as I supposed. The man was so scared he could hardly talk to me. He said since the night of the interview he had been under watch. The folks in the big house had a suspicion he and his wife were planning to run away, and as a precaution, compelled him to bring the baby to them every night. The little one was placed at the foot of the bed in which the owner and his wife slept. The old man had placed a chair at his side, on which was a lighted candle and a pistol, and threatened to shoot the first person he found in the room after dark. Besides, a close watch had been kept on all of the cabins to see that none of their occupants were abroad at night. While he was talking, he was looking around constantly as if he expected someone to swoop down on us. After hearing his story, I told him to go back to his home and blow the lights out, leaving his door open so I could enter without attracting attention. Asking no questions as to my purpose, he returned and soon had his cabin in darkness. Getting as near his house as I could under covers of the corn, I hurried across the open space and pushed my way into the room where the man and his wife were awaiting me. Without wasting time, I proposed that the two of them go with me, leaving the baby behind. This the woman would not listen to. Her mother love prompted her to select bondage with her little one rather than freedom without it. When I endeavored to open the subject again, she became hysterical, for fear was going to compel her to go against her will. Seeing my efforts were unavailing, I dropped the discussion. I then proposed to the man that he enter the sleeping room of the big house and rescue the baby from the foot of the bed. This he refused to do, as he was afraid of the big pistol at the owner's head. I attempted to bolster up his courage by holding up to him the hopes of freedom, but he was not to be moved. As I did not feel it was my duty to endanger my life as well as my liberty on their behalf, I pressed the woman to go to the rescue of the baby. I think she would have made the effort, but for her husband, who was thoroughly cowed by the fear of the man of the house. When I urged her again, she hesitated, and as she faltered, the man broke in, saying that they were not anxious to leave and thought they better not try. From the tenor of the talk, I knew that nothing could be expected from them, and any effort of rescue must come from myself. To press them further meant that they would abandon the trip, and I would return home empty-handed. Having gone this far, I decided to go all the way, enter the forbidden room, and rescue the child from the bed. Coming to this decision, I made them get their possessions in readiness to move. The woman, who was a servant in the house, described its interior, which was very simple indeed. From the small porch at the rear of the house, she said a door opened into a large living room. From this, a door led into the sleeping apartment where the child was to be found. There was no locks on any of the doors, they being held by wooden latches. With these facts known, I began to make my plans. I informed both of them I was going to take the child if I could. In the meantime, they were to take their position in the road below the house. If they heard any shooting, they were to go back to their cabin at once, and I would take care of myself. At all events, they were not to take chances of discovery for fear it might spoil future plans. With these final instructions, I took off my shoes, handing them to the man, and pressing him with the fact that in case of trouble, he was to take them back to his hut and destroy them. Together we left the cabin. The man and the woman went through the field to take their station on the road. I started for the house, going directly to it from the quarters. As I approached the place, I could see the candle glow through one window, and I knew that was the sleeping room. Getting into the shadow of the house, I endeavored to peep in, but the curtains were pulled down, shutting off my view. There was nothing for me to do but make my way into the place and trust to my good fortune to pull me through. Crossing the porch, I came to the kitchen door, which I found unlocked as the woman told me. Raising the latch, I pushed it open and entered the room. I was careful to leave the door wide open so that my retreat in that direction was assured. Standing on the threshold of this strange house, I am frank to say I felt the graveness of my position. For a moment my nerve left me, and I am positive I would have run at the least noise. As my eyes became used to the darkness of the place, my courage came back to me. The floor of the kitchen was of rough boards, so that my footing was uncertain. As I picked my way across the room, it seemed to me I struck every loose board in the place. The large crack at the bottom of the door of the sleeping room, through which the rays of candles showed, guided me surely to my destination. At the door I hesitated, for I felt I was taking my life in my hand in opening it. If I only knew whether the man was a sound or light sleeper, it would have eased my mind just then. The wife, too, was an unknown quantity. These were a multitude of other things came to my mind, and as I stood with my hand on the latch of the sleeping room, ready to open it to an unknown fate. Twice I put pressure on the latch, and twice my heart failed me. The third time my thumb pushed down on the fastening, and it gave way. It was the last point at which I hesitated, for as the latch noiselessly left its place, I felt I was given over to the excursion of the task. Whatever might be the results, to retreat now was impossible. Silently, I started to open the door. It swung well for a short distance, then the hinges began to squeak. Everything was quiet, and my nerves were so wrought up, it seemed to me that the hinges were making noise enough to waken the household. I stopped pushing the door, and putting my ear to the opening, I could distinguish the regular breathing of the couple. With this assurance, I persevered in opening the door in spite of the noisy hinges until I got view of the interior of the room. Then I saw that the bed was one of the old style, with a high footboard, and was standing immediately in front of the door. The hands of the man and woman were in plain view. At the man's side was an old wooden chair in which stood the lighted candle. There also, close to the candlestick, lay a pair of formidable horse pistols. I could see everything but the baby, which was hidden somewhere on the other side of the high footboard. While I was standing there, the man turned over restlessly, with his face away from the chair and the pistols. I reasoned it out that the child would be on the woman's side, because she was the one who would take care of it during the night. With this in mind, I stooped down, and under the shadow of the bedstead, made my way on my hands and knees across the floor to the woman's side of the bed. As I was about to peer around the corner of the footboard, I heard the door close behind me. I certainly felt I was in a predicament, shut in the room with a desperate man and a noisy woman in search of someone else's baby. Being concealed by the high bed, I stopped long enough to look around and locate the door and its latch in case of trouble. There was nothing for me to do but to secure the baby and get away as quietly as I could. Peeping around the foot of the bed, I saw a bundle lying close to the edge. Without wanting to see what it was, I dragged it towards me, getting a firm hold, pulled it off the bed. As I did, there was a creak of the bed springs, and the next moment the room was in darkness. There was no cause for secrecy now, so I jumped to my feet and rushed to the door. I heard the stool upset and the pistols fall. I heard the quick breathing of the man as he sprung out of bed and began feeling around on the floor in the dark for his weapons. Opening the door with a jerk, I ran across the kitchen, out into the yard, with the bundle still in my arms. From their position in the room, the man and women saw me hurry out of the house toward the road. Confident of my success, they, my two adult fugitives, started toward the river. When I was within a few rods of them, I heard the crack of a pistol and a bullet went singing over my head. Instantly, the two ahead of me swerved to one side of the road and started toward the cornfield. By this time, I was opposite them, and seeing their purpose, I called to them that I had the baby. The man said something about going back to the cabin and started in that direction with the woman after him. There was no time to argue, seeing the two were about to desert me. I yelled as I went by them I had the baby, and if they wanted it, they would have to follow me. In a few minutes I heard the patter of their feet on the hard road as they came running after me. We soon reached the top of the riverbank. There was a skiff at the landing, which I made the man turn loose so that we could not be pursued. My own little craft was soon made ready, and I made the man lie down on the bottom of the boat so that only two persons could be seen from the shore. Instead of going directly across, which could land me in front of my own house. I rowed upriver. I could see the other boat float down with the current, so that I felt there was no danger from that quarter. We were about a third of the way across the river when we saw lights down at the landing, which we had just left. We were still in plain sight, and I heard the voice of my employee shouting the name of the man in the bottom of the boat, warning him to come back. His threats fell on deaf ears, as I only increased my efforts to get across the river. Arriving on the opposite side, I asked the man for my shoes, but much to my astonishment, he said he had dropped them in his flight. They were a new pair of heavy shoes, coarse and different from what I was accustomed to wear. Still, the shoes were a clue, and I was nervous as to how the matter would come home to me. While I was provoked, I could not stop to find fault, as the party had to be in hiding or out of town before morning. Securing my skiff, we hurried up the bank to the home of my friend, the attorney. I only took time to tell him he must look after the fugitives, and then hastened home to prepare for the visit I expected would follow. Without striking a light, I undressed and got into bed. It was no time to sleep, so I lay awake, arranging my plans. Soon I heard voices outside, with a loud knocking at the door. I was out of bed at the first sound. Throwing up the window, I demanded who was making such a row. There were 3 men below, and the man who worked for me was the spokesman. He was evidently surprised to find me, as he suspected me the first one, and expected I was away with the fugitives. In spite of finding me at home, he began accusing me of running away his father's people. I protested. "But you run them away," he cried. "No one but you could steal that baby." "What baby?" was my response. "You know all about that baby, and it is in your house." Ordinarily, I never permitted anyone to search my premises. This time I did not care, so I told them to wait while I put on my clothes, and I would come down and take the party through the house myself. This seemed to take them back completely, but I knew the longer I kept them busy with me, the less likely they were to find their people. After consuming considerable time in dressing, I went down. The old man had his horse pistols in hand, and he was mad clear through. I am sure if the old man had found his people in the house, he would have shot me down in cold blood. We went through the place room by room. They were completely crestfallen when the last corner was searched, and they failed to find the runaways. As the young fellow went out, he turned and said, "I believe you were over the river just the same, and know where my people are." The night search was nothing compared to the scene I had when Shroff came into the shop the next morning, dangling across his arm my new shoes, which had been dropped the night before by his runaway slave. He showed the shoes in my face, again declaring I had dropped them in getting his people away. I just as stoutly denied the accusation. He had me scared when he said he was going from store to store in the town until he found the shoes identified. Well, I put up a good bluff. I did try to beat him uptown to tip off the merchant from whom I had purchased the shoes on the previous day. All I could do was hope and pray that the merchant would not give me away. Shroff, true to his word, did go from shoe shop to shoe shop, and not a soul had ever seen the shoes before. Shroff hung around my shop the rest of the day, but he never came back to work for me. If he had only kept still, I would never have thought to run his people off, but he put me on my mettle, so I rather felt called upon to carry out the enterprise to his own discomfiture.